and I'm a research analyst with the Utah Criminal Justice Center. I'm going to begin our session today with the Indigenous Land acknowledgement that was released by the University of Utah this last September 2020. The University of Utah has both historical and contemporary relationships with Indigenous peoples. Given that the Salt Lake Valley has always been a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and is a crossroad for Indigenous peoples. The University of Utah recognizes the enduring relationships between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We are grateful for the territory upon which we gather today, virtually albeit. We respect Utah's Indigenous peoples, the original stewards of this land, and we value the sovereign relationships that exist between tribal governments, state governments, and the federal government. Today, approximately 60,000 American Indian and Alaska Native peoples live in Utah. As a state institution, the University of Utah is committed to serving Native communities throughout Utah in partnership with Native nations and our urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Second, a thank you to the Utah Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for their partnership in providing this and other virtual events that we've offered throughout the fall. All events, including this series, will continue to be available as free public resources on our Utah Criminal Justice Center YouTube page. Closed captioning will be available for the YouTube recordings of our events, and I'm committed to increasing the accessibility of our events going forward. So if you have any feedback or comments to help us improve our events, please feel free to reach out to me directly. My email address is jessica.seawright@utah.edu. Welcome everyone to the last event in our fall virtual event series. You are joining us for the first of 3 discussions of the book, What Works and Doesn't in Reducing Recidivism, which is by Drs. Latessa, Listwan, and Ketzel. This week and next, Dr. Christian Sarver, Associate Director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center, will guide our group's discussion. And the final week, December 16th, she'll be joined by the authors of the text to answer questions and discuss concepts within our community context. So hoping that we can really make the concepts in the text and what's talked about very real and useful for you all who are joining us. A final note that any resources brought up, as well as the quiz that you need to take for CEUs, will be provided after the final session on the 16th, and that will be provided by email from Emily Breen. Thank you to her and the College of Social Work team. Any questions or comments can be sent at any time to myself or ucjc@utah.edu. Additional requests for technical assistance and support is also an option. And please feel free to use the chat function, the Q&A function, question and answer function on Zoom throughout this session and future sessions. Thanks for listening to that spiel. Dr. Sarver will respond to your questions and follow up as necessary. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I'm going to turn the time over to Christian.
And let's see, Christian is going to get her slideshow going. Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. Welcome everyone today. My name is Christian Sarver. As Jessica mentioned, I work at the Utah Criminal Justice Center. I also teach in the College of Social Work in the forensic concentration, and I have taught this book to students. In addition to that, I, along with Jessica and some of our other staff who are here today, conduct the correctional program checklist. Some of you may have heard of that. It's an assessment of how well programs that work with justice-involved persons adhere to the evidence based on recidivism. So a lot of the decision to kind of run this group is that one of the recommendations we're often making to providers who work with justice-involved persons is that they should be reading the literature. I think if you are like me, the last thing I want to do at the end of the day is read research on what works and doesn't to reduce recidivism. So our hope with this is this could give you kind of a little structure and support around that. That said, I also want to thank those of you who agreed to sign up for a reading group, because I have gotten so many questions in the past month. What is a reading group? So there's an element of bravery here. So I appreciate all of you we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward today, but I think one goal that I really have here is that I won't be presenting the material. We will be discussing it per your reading, your experience, and that really the goal here is to kind of have an interdisciplinary discussion on what we think of this information and how it applies, doesn't apply, how we struggle to kind of integrate it into the work we're doing. In terms of the schedule, so today, obviously, we'll be talking about chapters 1 through 4 through the book. You should all have received the discount code, so hopefully you were all able to get the book. Next week, we'll also be doing some group discussion on chapters 5 to 8. And then the final session will actually have the authors with us in a panel. My hope is really that by that point, we have kind of worked through some of the issues that come up in this book, and we're able to actually go to them and say, like, hey, we've been talking about this and this still doesn't make sense to us. What do you do with this? How do you explain this? That we're really able to kind of collectively have the opportunity to ask them questions that you don't always get to ask. To get started, we are going to put you into small groups. And Jessica, would you mind throwing these questions into the chat so folks have them? It would help me as we start this to really have a sense of kind of who all is in the group and what's your interest in the book. So if you're, I know we have folks from corrections, we have treatment providers, we have students. I saw in the list that we have a whole host of folks. So if you could just as a group kind of collectively define kind of who you are, what's your interest in this book, how you would rate your familiarity with the research and content discussed in this book, kind of not all to very familiar. What do you hope to take away from these series? And the last question is not a shaming question, but if you've done the reading chapters 1 to 4 today or not. And the point with that is I think that just helps me understand kind of where we're at as we're moving forward with these questions in terms of asking and answering them. So again, I'm not going to be, I'm not your teacher, so there won't be any negative feedback for that. I would like you to just appoint someone to report out from your group. So we're going to give you about 5 minutes to do this. Jessica, does that sound okay? And then just in the interest of time, have each of you kind of, as you report back, identify in your group kind of what's the professional representation, what's the broad interest, what's the familiarity as a group, some takeaways that you're hoping to get, and kind of as a percentage, if your group has been able to get the reading done for today. Sound good? Hey, Jessica will be sending you into groups for 5 minutes, and we will see you shortly when you get back. Sorry, when you get back.
Okay, you should have received your invitation.
I can speak for our group.
Thanks.
So yeah, so it's nice meeting everyone in there. We have a mix of folks, you know, some from corrections, some from county probation, the county, and then also academia. So we had a kind of a mixed representation of folks from different areas. Everyone had a pretty good sense of familiarity with the concepts that are discussed in this book. Just kind of they've worked with it, they've heard these terms before. So they're excited to learn from others. So too am I, and just kind of hearing how these things can better the odds of reducing recidivism for their caseloads, and for those in academia, kind of being able to convey this message to folks that are going to be entering the field. And some folks have done the reading, some others have just received their text within the last couple of days, and one other was on vacation. So just returning, plan to catch up and follow along as we go.
Yeah, and thank you. Please don't feel like you have to give excuse. Like, really, I just want to have a sense of like how much time I need to stop and spend on kind of the concept. So I was myself up last night reading it late. So I mean, I've read it before, but so thank you, Derek. Next group, anyone willing to report?
Sure, I can check in for our group.
Great.
We also had a pretty good mix. We had a psychologist, a social worker, someone from a treatment provider, and I'm from criminal justice, and we had a student.
Awesome.
About half of us had done the reading, and all of us were here kind of a variety of reasons, everything from learning the best practices to engage clients that are criminal justice involved, to learning about even what recidivism and what those practices are, to kind of learning what's the most up-to-date or most current trends.
Great, thank you. And I think we have one more group. Jessica, how many groups were there? 3?
I could talk for our group.
Great, thank you.
A couple of us were from county probation, and another mental health intern at the Utah State Prison, and another a clinical social worker from a treatment facility. And none of us had the book, I think in part due to COVID restrictions, buildings being closed and stuff like that, but we just didn't have the book. I know you said not to make excuses, but yeah, all of us would have loved to read the book and be caught up today, but we're not. And so, we had, we're all not very familiar, but, considerably familiar and wanting to improve our expertise and apply it to what we do.
Thank you. And again, yes, I've set this up so hopefully today we can have a discussion. I was hoping you all would have some experience, or some of you would. And then we'll be sending the questions that we have today with you. So as you are reading the book, once you get it, you will hopefully still have those and be able to come back next week and talk more about those. Did we miss any group? Did anyone's group not?
I can speak for our group.
Okay, great, thank you.
So I work for the prison. We had some treatment providers and somebody from the county school district. It seems like everyone had some familiarity with the concepts of recidivism. And some of us had read it, some of us skimmed it, some of us hadn't received the book yet. And it seems like everyone had a vested interest in making sure they could use best practices to reduce recidivism in the future.
Thank you. I am thrilled to hear that we have such an interdisciplinary group. I think one of our big hopes with this session is that we tend to be trained in silos, right? So if we're in corrections, we're trained from a corrections lens with other people in corrections. If we're in treatment, if we're a treatment provider, I would say there's even kind of a public-private difference there in terms of being a public provider versus a private provider. And then also, I think this issue can touch schools, homeless providers, right? Others who are not specifically tasked with recidivism, but still are probably encountering. So I'm thrilled to have kind of the wide range of you. A couple things to get started. The purpose of this, and part of this is just really why we're reading this particular book. It very much aligns with Utah policy. So those of you, I'm sure, who work in corrections and for public treatment providers in particular, would be familiar with the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, right? So that is all based on this particular body of research. But what we wanted to do is really focus on this theoretical perspective that helps folks understand if your interventions or our interventions aren't working, that doesn't necessarily mean that the intervention itself it's wrong. It helps us understand like where things fell apart. And I think those of you who are familiar perhaps with the audit that recently came out that said we implemented policies, we haven't had the change that we expected to see. I think hopefully as you read through this book, you will start to see that it's not because the research doesn't support the efficacy of the model, it's because there are ways where we haven't implemented it. And I think it's important to understand that as you're making decisions about the clients you work with. Again, this is really focused on a body of knowledge. So I think some of you who were able to read the book probably saw the section where they talked about that there was a point in time where you could probably find studies that said cigarettes weren't harmful to your health, right? But that overwhelmingly the body of research tells us that they're not good for you, certainly. So I think thinking about like, how can we parse out not just individual studies, but really what is the whole body of research telling us? I think our focus today really, or over this session, is really going to be an application to practice, identifying problems with implementation. The focus of this research is really on designing effective programs. So you will see in this book, it isn't just about how I as an individual clinician work with someone, it's how I set up my processes for intake, assessment, reassessment, treatment to kind of maximize the impact of whatever interventions I'm using. And then, as I mentioned, we're really hoping to create this interdisciplinary learning community. So we are not going to cover every single thing in the book. I think the book has lots of great practical hands-on examples for you and will hopefully be useful to you going forward. But our hope is really also that these conversations continue going forward, that you create you have an opportunity to continue to hear from each other and kind of learn from each other. Any questions on that before I move on? There's a couple concepts I just want to kind of get us on the same page on before we go into the questions. Any questions about kind of what we're doing, why we're doing it? Okay, so as we're moving forward, when we talk about crime with respect to this book, I think there's so many differences, right, in terms of criminal codes and what counts as a crime, that really the definition we're going to be using for this is any behavior that would put you, that would put an individual kind of as the focus of criminal justice professionals, right? So kind of accounting for the fact that laws are different across states, judicial districts, kind of, it can be different in different settings, that we're really just talking about any behavior that could draw the criminal justice system to you, and that's essentially whether or not you're actually apprehended, right? So just thinking about crime as breaking of the law. When I talk about the term antisocial, I don't mean that at all in terms of like a psychotic antisocial personality disorder. Some of you may be familiar with that and have worked with those individuals. This is really antisocial in this term when we're talking about behaviors, attitudes, are really kind of against societal norms. So kind of we have this prescribed ways of behaving that are designed to kind of protect the well-being of all of us, and antisocial behaviors would be behaviors that go against that. So that could be, say, cheating or something, right? It's not psychopathy. Criminogenic needs, we'll be talking a lot about those. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term, but that's really those domains that are statistically associated with recidivism. So problems in those domains are associated with recidivism. This model is unique in that it really says, regardless the type of crime, it's problems in those areas that cause the behavior. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about sex offending, substance abuse problems, theft, violence, whatever it is, right? So that is something that is very unique to this model. It is contradictory, I think, to some other bodies of research and to some people's practice experience. So I would like to encourage you as we move through the book to really, if there are areas where you're like, this is completely different than my experience, can we talk about this, right? Because it's a unique and specific model that says, regardless of the offense type, you should be looking at problems in these particular areas. And again, we'll be talking more about what those areas are. I think the book, obviously, because we're talking about recidivism and criminal justice, is very behaviorally focused. That's also different from a lot of, at least, social work practice, which might be diagnosis or symptom focused, right? Kind of, is the client experiencing symptoms? How does the client feel? Is there a level of distress that changes? The ultimate goal here really is behavior, right? Because we are really talking about recidivism. Is the person continuing to commit antisocial acts going forward as after treatment? And then the final thing here is that this is really a social learning model. I think in some ways the revelatory or the revolutionary piece of that to me is that it basically says that antisocial behaviors, criminal behaviors, are learned in the same ways that we as humans learn all behavior, right? So there's not some sort of unique pathology for the most part towards criminal behavior, that we learn it experientially by engaging in behavior and having a response to that behavior. So you will see in this model, and those of you who have studied this somewhat, the emphasis on, for example, role plays and experiential and behavioral models. It's because the model assumes that you learn behavior by engaging in the behavior and having a consequence for it. So obviously we don't want to go out and join people as they commit crimes and then respond to that, right? So in the treatment setting, you're having to somehow create a replication of the behavior that you're responding to in order to kind of change that long term. Questions about any of that? Again, this is just sort of some groundwork as we move forward. But I do want to give you the opportunity, if any of this is like, what's she talking about, or this. Good? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is again, put you back into groups. And in this case, Jessica and I are going to kind of float in the groups and help guide the discussion. I do want, for those of you who have read the book, and as we go forward, if you have outstanding questions for the book, I would like at this point to give you the opportunity to pose them to the group. And moving forward into next week, I'd rather start with your questions than my questions. Again, I know right now, if folks were intermittently able to even get the book, read the book, that's, I do have some questions prepared that we'll put you into small groups to discuss, but I want to give, if anyone has something that's outstanding, just as we start, I'd love to give you the opportunity to ask. Poor Greg is at the top of my screen, so Greg Garrett, just so I can see you, I'm like, you're the only one whose face I can see, so if you're feeling pressure, I'm like, do you have a question? And again, this is obviously a limitation of Zoom that I can't even see most of you. I think for the moment, what we will do is go ahead, put you in groups. And I think, again, those of you who were able to do the reading and those of you who weren't, I think we can still have a conversation from your experience around two of these important questions that were, I think, come out of chapter 1. And one of them is this idea of what's the relationship between public safety, punishment, and treatment. And with that, what I think is really interesting is how we define public safety, what is the role of punishment in achieving public safety, and what is the role of treatment in achieving public safety. And the book, again, has some ideas about that. I think you all, based on your experience, have some ideas about that. And then the other thing is really kind of getting at this idea, what does it mean to say that correctional treatment is effective? What is that? Again, people are happier at the end of it. People complete all their sessions. People dye their hair blue. Like, what in your reading of the book or your experience does it mean to say that treatment is effective? And I think we will give you, so we're going to stay with chapter 1 for this first breakout. Jessica, give, what, 7 minutes? Does that? And again, I think this is going to be, I want to create space for all of you to ask questions, but I think designating a reporter out and maybe not making the person who had to do it last time. So designate a different reporter out. And again, Jessica and I will be floating in with you. So,
okay, I'm going to open those rooms
before we put you back in. Okay.
So were there questions we were supposed to be, they were in the chat box, right?
Yeah. So what is the relationship between public safety, punishment, and treatment? And then what is effective correctional treatment?
I think effective correctional treatment to me would mean they don't come back to prison. So, I mean, that's kind of the biggest goal that we have at the prison when we're doing treatment, is just trying to reduce the risk that we'll ever see them again. So in my opinion, I think that's the biggest thing. That's what I would say was effective if they don't come back.
I agree. I mean, I come from a very trauma focused perspective. And so I think, also that they are truly able to have a better life and have resolved some of the trauma that has created the behaviors that have gotten them in prison.
Yeah, I think going along with that, a lot of it is, I found life skills, figuring out life skills while they're in treatment so that they can not come back, in addition to the trauma and all that they have going on.
Yeah, I think those are two tough questions that are sometimes opposites of each other. Like the treatment one seems a little bit easier to me. Like we can go ahead and define that. Like we want you to just not come back to jail. We want you to not keep crossing the line of what these arbitrary laws are. And that's our basis of standard. Like we can reach that. We can try to reach that. We can treat to that. But what is the responsibility or whatever that other question was between public safety, punishment, that kind of stuff. That's a real kind of moral debate on laws are just arbitrary. Somebody made them up. They do disproportionately affect certain people. And when somebody has been identified by this arbitrary rule, like it could have been because they were poor, they were homeless, they were drug users, they had mental illness, something like that. But once they're identified as a criminal, anything else they do is on them. Like society gets to wash their hands. But if you're wealthy, you can buy your way out of the system. If you're privileged, you can avoid a lot of it. You can do a lot of other things where your misbehaviors aren't labeled as criminal. So it's really hard. Like what's the social responsibility for public safety when we don't see wealthy, privileged individuals as breaking public safety, even if they're doing the same behaviors? I mean, that's a real big moral argument that's a little bit harder to address than counseling, I think, or treatment. So that could be a tough little corner to get stuck in.
And that's something I'm wondering, Jessica, if you've read the entire book, because I've just skimmed different chapters. Is the inequality addressed in any of the research of how some populations are targeted more in a sense, or do you have other good recommendations for readings to address that?
I think that the field at large is really contending with disparities or overrepresentation. And I think there's some existing literature that might be of interest to you and others. And then there's emerging, just based on current events, there's always emerging resources and literature. So we'll be sure to share some of those resources at the final session in case you want to keep reading and keep learning. I think that that's a good point. What comes to mind is also this role in at least what works, this conversation of risk assessment, because we don't want to look at someone as just one action, but is risk assessment and formal risk assessments like the LS R&R and others, the WRNA comes to mind. Are they helpful in seeing a fuller with limitations picture of an individual, their needs, their strengths, what they walk into, and who they should be in treatment with? When we think about public safety, punishment, and treatment, who should be treated with who? Who should be in the same room together is a question that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, at Cornerstone, we really try to be aware. We tend to have no low risk clients, and so we keep them in separate groups as best as we can. But I'm curious on different types of groups, because I know from one of the audits, they were saying doing things to fidelity, and some of our groups need to do better with that. So I'm wondering how other treatment providers are addressing more of the criminogenic risks in therapy.
Mm-hmm. I noticed the timer saying we have 21 seconds. In case we get bounced back to the group, I've written down disparities and also fidelity for us to follow up with in a different session or in resources. So I'm going to bounce out. See you soon. Christian's muted, so why don't we have somebody take it over while she's troubleshooting that. Does somebody want to talk about chapter 1, Christians?
I can talk for my group. It's Maddie Drury here. Our discussion was around corrections and what it looked like maybe more in the 60s and 70s to the shift that we've seen now. In the past that it's been a little bit more of the get tough, deterrence, which was shown not to be fully effective, right? To now we're seeing a much more focus on rehabilitation and treatment. And not just that that's the only way to be effective, but it's going to be a balance of both of these things. And evidence-based practices, as we continue to do research and follow up on that research, we know how to better balance those, right? And so we have kind of a discussion as well with rewards and sanctions and what that looks like. Absolutely part of the treatment process is there's accountability pieces in there as well, and that we can work together with treatment and with the courts in doing that. We also talked about maybe the public side, when we talk about public safety and the public reaction to things that come up on the media, right? And then that administrations or legislators then feel a lot of pressure to make decisions where they might want to get stuff. But sometimes, it's really hard to try to balance that with the public and say, hey, that's not necessarily fully effective. And we just had to short discussion on JRI from 2015.
Thank you all. Thanks, Maddie, for reporting. Your group maybe talked about this, but from my perspective, one thing that comes out of this book in terms of that public safety piece that is so important is that this model is obviously driven by risk assessment. And I'm sure all of you are being told all the time, you got to assess for risk, you got to assess for risk, you got to make decisions based on risk, right? And I think one of the emperor in the room over risk, right, is that risk assessment is a group assessment, right? Risk assessment is saying these folks are more likely to recidivate and these folks are less likely. It isn't telling you at the individual level that Christina is not going to, but Derek is going to, right? So as probation officers, correctional staff, therapists, right, you are actually sitting with Christina and Derek, right? And you don't know which one of them is going to recidivate or not, right? So it's, I mean, when I talk about kind of this is about how to design programs, there is this gap that I think feels kind of fundamentally unsatisfying in some ways, right? Because you can't know for sure, right? Like someone might be identified as high risk, but who actually never recidivates. Someone at low risk might recidivate. And from a public perspective, right, there's also this feedback about like, why are you letting these people out? Why are you letting these people out? And I think it's important to just kind of sit with that and acknowledge that, like, yeah, there's no way, if we don't lock people up forever, and I'm not advocating that we do lock people up forever, there has to be some way we make decisions that isn't just flip a coin, right? We want to increase our chances from flip a coin to like, how do we have people in the community in a way that is the most safe, and also acknowledges that risk can be reduced, right? That risk isn't static, and that we also tend to think of risk as like someone's high risk and they're high risk forever. And in fact, right, risk, you can change, that's all of your job, right? To change risk. So, so anyway, thank you, Maddie, for putting out. And another group want to? My poor group didn't assign anyone, and you know that I'm going to have one of you do it, so.
Well, I'll jump in for our group. So we also spoke about punishment and punitiveness and the fact that the court system is largely adversarial and tends to impose punishment rather than positive reinforcement and positive change. And then the one guy in our group, Chris, has got a lot of experience and spoke to the way they do it in corrections, where they assess according to risk, and all their programs are actually cognitive behavioral based. And it was interesting because the last question of what is effective correctional treatment, I actually asked in his 21 years of experience, has he ever come across a program that's not CBT based that works? And the answer was no. So yeah, and then there was just the general discussion around punishment and how it's largely ineffective in terms of behavior change.
I'm curious, Aureen, how is your group defining effective? What does it mean to say that treatment is effective in this?
Well, just in terms of recidivism. And, you know, yeah, that's how so, I mean, Chris was just talking about this, just the same things you've spoken about, how they assess risk using the LSCMI, and then they, you know, obviously try to keep the low risk people having less dosage and away from the high risk, because exposure causes increased recidivism for low risk people.
I'm curious how, if anyone else in the group had a different definition of effective. Is that simply just recidivism, yes, no? Is that the person offends again or doesn't offend again? Is that how you were?
Chris, you should probably jump in here.
Yes, I would love to. Sorry to pick on you, Chris. Small group, you're gonna.
Well, no, that's okay. And I just yeah, from a perspective of whether or not a correctional intervention is effective, I would say yes. We would look for basically two things: risk reduction, and then that they don't reoffend, because of course that makes our community safer if we can stop that cycle. And that's typically, we try to achieve that through that positive behavior change.
Thank you. Any other group have any other?
I hope the group that I was with doesn't mind me kind of kicking it off, but I really liked how you all were talking about not only it not returning, but it's bolstering and building up skills that are needed to thrive in the community after, whether that's after being in prison, in jail, or after being in treatment in an outpatient capacity. Did I understand that right?
So that risk reduction piece, am I getting that? I mean, so I think so we have typically judged interventions, right? And that makes sense, I think, Chris, what you mentioned about, right, this public safety piece, do they offend or not? Is the risk level lower or not? I mean, I think there's also, and as we move through this book, some interesting ways to think about, is it successful if we, for instance, extend the time before, right? So instead of returning in 6 months, the person doesn't return for 2 years, right? Is that still effective? Like, how long can we expect an intervention to have that effect? Or do we need other, some measures of reintegration that maybe effective includes not just doesn't offend, but also has a job they're happy with, has some friends, or, I'm speculating here, but I think it's an interesting question to think as you move through this book of like, what's effective and what can a correctional intervention really, right? Like, corrections is one isolated system, and in some ways we're like, okay, Chris, you take this guy whose life has sort of not ever functioned as it should, and you get him fully back on track, right? And so I think I just would like to have that kind of out there in our minds, is like, how should this actually be a thing that is not just for corrections, but that is actually part of what makes it effective, is the intervention integrates someone into some other conventional social institution. So, and again, I say that not because I don't think corrections is doing a great job. I say it because I think it's a little bit unfair for us to expect corrections to entirely achieve that. And I don't know if there are any responses from corrections for that, or.
I think I've mentioned that I've skimmed the book, and I'm wondering if in the book it gives more of a definition to like what is conventional or pro-social behaviors that we're wanting to see and get them to.
Yes, I think that is such a great question. The book does, so what you've read so far skims that. The chapters coming up for next week go into more detail with that, but I think what you will see, I think, in this model is this idea that there are deficits, right, in education, employment, social relationships that kind of lead someone towards offending, but that a lot of that is really driven through this idea of antisocial behaviors and attitudes. And your book gave some examples of that. I'd love to hear from the rest of you how you've experienced, but that would be things like, it's okay if I steal this because everyone's doing it, or because society has treated me unfairly, so it's okay that I do this. Attitudes that really kind of minimize or justify harm done to others, and or breaking the law. I think it's important to, have any of you used the TCU, Texas Christian University Criminal Thinking Scale? Is that anyone familiar with that? So are you familiar with the current kind of controversy around it? So the Texas Christian University Criminal Thinking Scale is a scale that was designed to assess criminal attitudes. And it really looks at some of those things that your book talked about in terms of techniques of neutralization. So this idea that you're really you're assessing your behavior from the lens of, it wasn't that bad, it didn't hurt that much, I was justified in doing it because of something else that happened to me, everyone's doing it, the criminal justice system is just out to get me, right? So kind of positioning yourself in this way that's like, the world has treated me unfairly. So the Texas Christian University Criminal Thinking Scale, which I have recommended to people for a long time, I'm happy to send it out so you all can see it and assess yourselves and see where you fall on the criminal thinking scale. It will also, I think, to your point, give you some concrete examples of what people mean when they talk about that. But there have been some interesting conversations around that now, with kind of the current conversations around policing as well, and kind of acknowledging, well, maybe some people actually are treated unfairly. So how do we balance, like, what's an attitude versus what's kind of a systemic, and I mean, I don't have an answer for that. I don't think the criminal thinking scale has an answer for that, but I think that's part of where your clinical judgment comes in, is kind of assessing, I have this assessment, this person comes back as, very high risk in terms of these criminal thinking things. And yet when I see this person's life, maybe that offers some context, right? So there's this professional discretion piece there versus this person. And I'm sure all of you have had people like that. I know in my practice settings, right? People where I'm like, hey, that person is not pro-socially oriented towards his colleagues or his friends, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. That I would say we are going to get there, but I think that's exactly the kind of thing we want to talk about, is like, what exactly does that look like? What does it mean to say someone has an antisocial attitude? Other reporting out from group. Any groups have something that we haven't discussed? I think this idea of public safety is really important as we go forward, and that we sort of conceptualize it entirely as the public. And I think folks from Salt Lake County Probation Services talked about kind of a sea change in their organization, thinking about, part of public safety is also reducing risk and reintegrating someone, right? Because if you reduce their risk, you have increased the public safety because you've reduced the chances that they are going to cause harm. So I think that's important to, like, how does that idea of public safety change? I am going to share my screen again. Okay, so slideshow. Can I tell you all, I mean, I feel like my learning curve on Zoom, I've gotten better, but I still would rather see you all in person. I'm so tired of Zoom. Okay, so chapter 2, we have about 10 minutes left. So what we're going to do is send out, we're going to email these questions to all of you to have to think about our discussion next week. There are a couple things I want to get to in terms of how we want to do this going forward. So these are questions for chapters 1 through 4. For next week, we'll be reading chapters 5 through 8, which really get at kind of the theory behind behavior change around recidivism, long-term behavior change, and specific treatment modalities. My preference is that you all are bringing questions to the group. Like I said, I will have some, but my preference is that you bring them all and are sort of pitching them to the group, because I think this is most useful as you are grappling with how your reading applies to your own work and how you're seeing it apply to other folks' work. So you can just come with those. You can email them to me if you'd rather have me bring them up. I still would love to hear your thoughts on what you're interested in. I think we will also come back and consider today's questions as you're going through. I would just have these in mind as you're moving forward with your reading. If anyone has particular interest in leading the discussion, I'm happy to kind of have you officially be a group leader in some small group work. To me, that's really interesting, I think, because you all have such diverse backgrounds, which is different than mine. Mine is primarily as a researcher. So I'm sure some of you have experienced this from me or other researchers, that it's very easy for me to come in and say, like, hey, Chris, this is the research, go do it, right? And that is much, much harder to implement when you're in an agency that has a lot of other competing demands, isn't right, but has a lot of other things it has to achieve over the course of a day, right? So I think there would be some benefit if any of you are interested. We also, as I mentioned, I'm thrilled to have the authors here at the end of this. So as we are moving forward, if you have any questions now for the authors based on as you've been trying to implement this, or you're reading, or as you come out of today's discussion, I would love for you to email me. And again, we will send these slides out to all of you so you have both the questions and my email. But I mean, I think the authors are already asking us, like, hey, what are their questions? What do they want to know? So I think it is really your opportunity to say, like, someone has been telling me for the past 5 years that I have to assess for risk, and yet that doesn't feel to me like it answers the questions that I think are important, or whatever things you've come up against in your work. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I do want to, so we have about 5 minutes left, just take the opportunity to kind of give you a chance to say what those of you who were able to read it, what were your questions? What outstanding questions do you have just from the discussion today? What would you like to touch on next week? I know it's pressure, sorry.
One that I have is if there's a good tool for treatment providers to use. We do rely on probation for like the LCMI, LSRNR, but if there's something treatment can do to assess as well.
Great, thank you. Great question. Where are you? Marquis, am I pronouncing your name right?
Yeah, I'm at Cornerstone Counseling Center.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Other questions that came up for you? Again, reading or experience working with justice involved persons. In my small group, one thing, and again, this is a question that interests me. I don't know if it interests others. I think this idea of punishment and that punishment can be effective, right? That if we over punish, obviously we're not achieving probably what we want, but how do we punish effectively towards behavior change and not just punishment? And I think that probably looks different in correctional versus treatment settings would be my guess. I know, again, I was trained as a social worker. It took me a long time to even be able to say the word punishment without feeling like, but there's, I think, super interesting thing about this book is this idea that punishment can be applied in a fair and just way with the goal of effectively changing behavior, and that's probably part of an effective treatment system. Okay, thank you. We have another question. And feel free to put them in the chat if that's easier.
I think some of the, if I'm remembering, a couple things came up in our group of just getting fidelity and quality assurance, and that really comes into play at the last part of the book. And also the authors are integral in, they created the correctional program checklist with which some of your programs may have familiarity with that. So thinking through maybe your own CPC report and building a specific question out of that is something to keep in mind when the authors join us. Also, if you all are really interested in bringing trauma-informed trauma into our discussions, please forefront that so that we can keep that in mind. Our director, Emily Salisbury, helps to round our team out and bring that to mind, so we can bring that more into the conversation if as clinical providers that's important to you. And finally, we'll do some work on the back end to provide additional resources. As Christian mentioned, what works and doesn't is within a community of research and scholarship. And so most definitely there are more work, there's more work being done. We're focusing on what works, but if you're interested in talking about disparity in sentencing, kind of disproportionate impact, we have folks on our team that we can connect you with and help you get some additional resources for your own particular interests. So please keep the questions coming to any of our direct email addresses or the general email, ucjc@utah.edu.
Thank you for all these questions. Specifically for the punishment question, chapter 5 for next week's reading is going to talk a lot about this idea of punishment and how, and again, I don't mean to keep saying that word if that's making some of you flinch, but I do think it's important. I think it's good practice for us to talk about, like, no, our goal here is to really help people, and how do we kind of use behavioral. In my group, we talked a lot about one thing that's unique to this model is it really presumes that offending is a learned behavior. People learn it, and they learn it in the same way they learn to ride a bike or learn to read or learn to do anything, right? That you have an experience and a consequence, and that's why the model is so experiential, right? I think that's been and I'm curious for those of you who are working in corrections, if you've seen that push, so that you're really being pushed to have this kind of experiential interaction versus I sit down with Gary and I tell Gary, these are the things I want Gary to do. Sorry to pick on you, Gary, you're in the middle of my screen. So, and the logic behind that is really this idea that people change their behavior based on doing something and having a response to it. And that's part of what we are trying to do with effective shaping of behavior. And that punishment doesn't mean just punish, it means respond in a way to distinguish a behavior, right? That you're trying to distinguish something, distinguish, not right word, right? You're trying to keep something from happening, trying to have a negative a negative. And when I say negative, I don't mean big, scary negative. I mean the serious, I'm going to give you this example and then it's going to be like, that's a big, scary one. Is she insane? But for example, would be if a kid touches a hot stove, right? And there's a burn there, right? Like that's the punishment. So it's not punishment just for punishment's sake. It's how the child learns not to touch a hot stove, right? So that's what we're thinking of, is like, how do we give people a response that's like, maybe I don't want to do that. And also provide these rewards that I'm saying, not only don't do that, but here's what you can do. And here's how we're going to encourage you to continue doing that behavior. So I know we're at the end. Thank you all for joining. We will see you next week. Thank you for these questions, and please continue to email over the week if you have others. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.